friends, welcome to the Alternative Homesteading channel, where we talk about how to grow food in any space. And part of growing food requires that we have good compost if we're going to be growing some of our food using hydroponics or raised garden beds or in pots. And so today I want to talk about worm composting, and specifically worm composting in your kitchen in the winter. I did a video tour sharing our kitchen renovation, and in that I mentioned how we worm compost in the kitchen in the winter inside. And a lot of you guys had questions, so I thought I would make a video and explain how to do it properly and just some of the details to see if it's something that you might actually be interested in doing on your own homestead. Whether you're in an apartment, in an HOA, or on an actual farm, we can be growing some of our own food and having self-sufficiency in any space, including growing some of our own compost. Now, there are some things to consider when you're composting in your kitchen. For one, you want to make sure you're composting correctly so that you're not getting mold or things like fruit flies introduced into your home. And so how do we do that? That's the first thing. The second thing we need to know is what kind of worms we need to compost with, because we don't just want earthworms out of the soil. We need special composting worms. And the third thing that we need to really be mindful of is how to properly feed and tend to our worm compost. So again, we don't have issues with mold or things like fruit flies. So first, what kind of worms do we want to use when we're worm composting? So when we are composting with worms, we are trying to get what's called worm castings. And basically worms take things and turn them into dirt, and that dirt is super nutrient rich and makes amazing fertilizer for your soil. When we're worm composting, we're not building massive bins of compost to fill garden beds. We're trying to get some worm castings that we're going to sprinkle on the top of our garden beds. We're going to introduce some into our garden pots, or I like to mix it in with my cocoa coir for my hydroponic harvest wall system to just increase the nutrients in the medium I'm growing in my hydroponic harvest wall system. So we're not going to be producing huge amounts of soil when we are composting with worms. But we are going to be producing very nutrient-rich compost that's almost more like fertilizer than it is compost. We can also use the byproduct, the liquid byproduct of our compost to make compost tea, or you can use your worm castings to make compost tea. Compost tea is an excellent thing to spray onto plants to make them healthy and vibrant. It'll help your plants to absorb nutrients more effectively. It'll prevent pests, lots of great things. And then we get all those good bacteria on our plants, and then we get to eat those healthy plants. Now, compost tea is a whole nother process and something we'll have to cover in another video. So for today's video, we're just specifically talking about how do we compost inside in the winter for a short period of time. Some people do compost fully inside in basements and in garages, and that is also an option. You would want a different compost system than what I am describing today. So again, we can cover that on another video. Today, we're talking about a temporary setup using a 5-gallon bucket. And this is just something we're doing over the winter for the sole purpose of making sure that we are producing that nutrient-rich compost to add as food to our spring gardens and to make sure our worms aren't dying due to being exposed to too much cold. It also prevents us from having to go outside in the cold when it's freezing to do some composting. So the type of worms we want to use when we're composting, they are called red wigglers. It's a special worm specifically for breaking down foods and making compost. Red wigglers are easy to find. You can Google them and find several resources. I will link my TikTok shop. That is where I share all my links now for you guys, because Amazon often changes and it becomes very difficult to keep those up to date. So if you head over to my TikTok shop, you can see where I share all sorts of products that we are using in our home and up-to-date videos. So those links are good. You can also just Google red wigglers and find them that way. Now, what do we feed our red wigglers? So when we're composting indoors or in general, there's certain things you don't want to feed your compost worms. We are not feeding them animal products. We are just doing fruits and vegetables. And we want to be careful not to do too many citrus fruits or introduce things like onions and garlics, because those can be a little bit harsh for our worms to handle. And I try not to compost things like avocado peels or banana peels or things that can take a really long time to break down. We want our worms to be really efficient at breaking things down since we are doing this indoors. When we're going to have problems with composting indoors is when we have too much food for our worms to eat and they can't break it down quick enough, and that allows for mold to develop or things like fruit flies. So how much do we feed them? That's another question. I like to keep it about 80% veggie scraps to 20% fruit scraps. You don't even have to ever add fruit if you don't want to. Fruit is going to add a lot of moisture, which too much moisture can cause some problems. Fruit can tend to mold more quickly and attract fruit flies. So I try to keep the fruit to a minimum. Now I juice. I do not consider my juicing pulp as fruit. It's really, really dry after I juice and have that pulp remnants. So even if there's that fruits in my juicing pulp, that still goes into my worm compost bin. It's actually a great way to compost all of your juicing scraps if you are juicing. Now, how much we actually feed our worms will depend on your food scraps and how healthy your worm colony is and lots of different factors. So I can't give you exact numbers. I would say anywhere from 1 handful to 2 handfuls of mostly 80% veggie scraps to 20% fruits once a week is safe. Now, if you open your bin and you see tons of food in there and it's starting to mold and it's not being broken down quick enough, then back off how much you're feeding them, let them catch up, and when about 75% of that food has disappeared, you can start introducing more. Sometimes they just need a minute, or if it's something like a full apple, it can just take a little bit longer to break that food up and turn it into beautiful compost. Now, when we're setting up our compost bin, I'm doing this in a bucket, and I have a gamma lid on my bucket, but it's actually not screwed in. I don't have the gamma lid rim because we do want a little bit of oxygen in there. So I just have a loose lid on top. You can just put the regular bucket lid on top to these as well. Just take it off every few days and make sure you've got fresh oxygen going in there so that we don't suffocate our worms. If you see a lot of water buildup, you will need to drain that off. And if that's the case, you may need to look at how you're feeding them and make sure you cut back on some of those water-rich foods so we reduce the amount of water in our compost bin. These shouldn't be sopping wet. They should be a nice, moist environment, but not a lot of excess liquid. When we're composting outside, when we're composting full time with worms, that is different. You will have what's called compost tea that needs to be drained out of your compost bins. And again, we will cover that in the spring in another video as we move our worms outside into their more permanent composting bin for the growing season. Now, to create a healthy environment for our worms, when you get your worms in the mail, I ordered 2,000. So anywhere from 500 to 2,000 is a great number, is a good amount for a bucket compost system. I haven't really honestly noticed a lot of difference in going to those higher 2,000. More worms doesn't mean it's going to break down faster, because actually it takes them a while to adapt and they start to naturally multiply on their own. So 500 will do the trick. In order to have a healthy colony and to make sure we're giving them the right environment to grow in, we need to set up our worm compost bin or our 5-gallon bucket to accommodate worms. So what you're gonna do is take cardboard and rip it up into pieces. It doesn't matter what size. They can be cutouts to the exact size at the bottom of your bucket, or you can just take scraps. But we want to do about 2 inches thick of cardboard on the bottom of our bucket. What that's going to do is give the worms a safe place to kind of habitat, and it's going to create a buffer between the worms and our food. If there's excess liquid, it will give that liquid somewhere to go so that we don't have too much liquid build up in our bucket. So about 2 inches of cardboard. Then you're gonna dump in your worms. They typically come in some worm castings, so some soil, and you just plop the whole thing in. After that, we want to take pieces of either newspaper or brown paper shopping bags, and we're just going to rip them up and shred them up and cover all our worms with a nice layer of either newspaper or brown bag shopping bags. After that, we want to do another layer of cardboard. This time it's only going to be 1 or 2 layers of cardboard thick, not excessive, just a nice gentle layer over the top. So again, just 1 or 2 nice little sheets of cardboard, and then you're going to add your first layer of composting foods. So any scraps you have in your kitchen, I would start with 2 handfuls, 2 pretty decent sized handfuls, plop those on top of the cardboard, and then your final step is to take more brown paper, whether it's brown paper from packaging, which I often have here, or brown bags from the grocery store. Cut those up a little bit and just make a nice sheet to go over the top of all of the food. And that is it. That's going to create a nice clean habitat for your worms that has everything they need to survive. So what's going to happen is they're going to start to come alive after if you've had them shipped. It can take a minute, but they're going to start to come alive, and they're going to find their way through that cardboard and through that paper to your food. They will start consuming that food and turning it into dirt, and you're going to notice you start to get all of that dry cardboard and that dried paper will start to get moist over time as they break down the food. And again, because we don't want to overfeed them, so we're not going to be adding compost every single day if we have large amounts. But if you have some scraps off of a zucchini, like the end pieces, or a couple of pieces of cucumber left over, or some lettuce, whatever it may be, just small scraps, just add those in daily and just lift up your paper layer on the top, drop those in, and cover it back up. And that's all we're gonna do. We're gonna keep an eye on it, check on it frequently, make sure they're eating the food at the same pace that you're putting it in there. You don't want an excessive amount of food building up, because that's gonna cause problems. And that's it. If you want to use your compost at the beginning of spring, you wanna stop feeding them about 6 to 8 weeks before it's time to start gardening and put that compost in your gardens. That way the worms have time to break down all that cardboard, all that paper, and all that food and turn it into worm casings. Now, when it comes time to use those, we can talk about that in another video, because that is a whole nother process that we need to go through. But really, we just have to separate our worms from our worm casings by sifting them out. We can use that beautiful compost to launch our gardens with nutrient-rich fertilizer for the soil, which is so great. You also have the option of not separating them, and you can put the worms directly into your garden beds, where they will continue to break things down and make your soil healthy as well. Worms in your kitchen may not be for everybody, but if it is interesting to you, it is a great way to start building up some compost for your spring gardens. Worm compost is some of the most nutrient-rich stuff you can be adding to your hydroponic gardening systems, adding as compost tea to your aeroponic gardens, and adding to your raised beds. So I highly recommend it if you've got the stomach for it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys on the next video.